Good evening, bookworms. I hope you're all excited for our discussion today. I'm Ariel, a resident bookworm of Fully Booked, here to discuss the book-to-screen adaptation of Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. For those of you in the Zoom room, you may already turn on your cameras if you would like. This discussion is being streamed on YouTube and will also be recorded for documentation purposes. We might use some clips or parts from this session and post it on our social media pages in the future. If you're tuning in through YouTube, hello, welcome, and feel free to use the comment section to share your thoughts and answers to the prompts that we'll be asking. If you're tuning in from outside the Philippines, welcome. We're so happy to have you here, and thank you for doing the time conversion just to make it here. Thank you. Before we begin, I think we're ready to start. Some people have their cameras on. Hello, it's so nice to see your faces. I think we can begin with our little icebreaker. So let's get to know the people in this discussion. In our registration form, we asked everyone to share their favorite authors, books, and genres. We created a word cloud to give everyone a quick glance at the type of readers in this call. There it is. So the larger words mean more repetitions or occurrences of that word. This category is books and authors. And for authors, we have Neil Gaiman, of course, Rick Riordan, Leigh Bardugo, George Orwell, who are quite similar in that very cool world-building sense. So word clouds are never complete without a wild card, Jane Austen, the pioneer of the romance genre, some would say. So raise your hand. You can use the raise hand function on Zoom if you answered any of the authors that I mentioned, or if you are a Jane Austen fan, such as myself. I'm raising my hand here on camera. Great. Okay, cool. Now, in terms of book titles, we have only one that's quite prominent, which is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, a very, very popular book on Book Talk and Bookstagram. Thank you for sharing your answers, bookworms. You can use the Zoom chat to give us your reactions, to talk to the other people in this call. So yeah, we'd love to hear from you. All right. Our next word cloud, yeah, because we made two, is favorite genres. There it is. All right. So fantasy, thriller, sci-fi, horror, and mystery are not surprising that we love these genres. That this is something we have in common, given that we are all Sandman fans. It seems that our group are made up of Halloween enthusiasts, not afraid of a spooky read, such as myself. I do love Halloween. I don't know if you can see, but I have some decor behind me. I would love to hear everyone's favorite books in these genres in the comment section. So if you have a favorite thriller or romance that you want to go ahead and recommend to the rest of the people in the call, please do so. Okay, and more big players on screen are romance, classics, YA, adventure, and superhero. So this is a pretty eclectic mix indeed. Feel free to use the Zoom chat again to give us your reaction. What do you think of this group? Do you feel at home? Do you feel seen? Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. All right, now that we get a sense of who the group is, we can begin. Welcome again to Fully Book's Cover to Cover, a reader meetup. You might be asking, what is Cover to Cover? Cover to Cover is our virtual interactive reader meetup. Last June, we discussed Alice Oseman's Heartstopper, which was a huge Netflix sensation based on a webcomic. This October, we're doing the same thing for Halloween with Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. We set this up so bookworms can get together and discuss their common interests in real time. In our experience, communities built around books are magic. But like all magic, we need to set our expectations and lay down some ground rules so nothing goes awry. Here is what to expect. First things first, the scope of our discussion covers Preludes and Nocturnes and The Doll's House. and the Netflix adaptation of The Sandman. Next, we will be comparing the comic versus the show. But if you haven't read the comic, it's okay. If you're not yet done, we'll adjust. That's okay. And finally, expect a fun, casual discussion with fellow fans. Think about today's get-together as your impromptu book or film and TV club. It's very rainy here in the Philippines, so thank you so much for making the time and for spending your evening with us. Now, on to some rules. So please do observe these rules so we can have a smooth and enjoyable discussion. 1, spoiler alerts. If you are updated with the Sandman comics, if you've read it till the end and know how the cookie crumbles, please try not to discuss spoilers. Or if you want to talk about something that's further into the story, kindly give a spoiler warning beforehand. Again, we're only discussing the first 2 graphic novels, which is essentially season 1 of the show. Next up, sharing builds camaraderie. Use the raise hand feature if you would like to share your answer. So if you want to speak on the mic, you may do so. Just use that raise hand function and we'll call you up. If you prefer not to talk, you can always use the chat feature of Zoom to share your thoughts. Number 3, be mindful of making unnecessary noise. So turning on your camera is optional, but please stay on mute if you are not speaking. Number 4, be open to listening. So there it is. Okay. Be sensitive of the time you used to share. We're all very excited to talk about the Sandman, but we want to also give others the opportunity to speak. Number 5, this is a safe space, so please keep your comments kind and respectful. This goes for both the YouTube live stream as well as the Zoom room. Finally, our conversation will be recorded and is currently being live streamed on YouTube. This is for documentation purposes, and you can opt to turn off your camera if you prefer not to be seen. Are there any questions or clarifications from the audience before we begin our discussion? None? If there's none, give us a thumbs up. Yep, all good. Great. Thank you everybody. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's slip into the world of the dreaming and get lost in our discussion of the Sandman. First things first, let's start with a poll. Which of the Sandman TV characters on screen would you choose to be your sidekick on a complicated quest? We'll give you 2 minutes to answer before showing the results. So you should be able to see the poll on your Zoom screen as well as on YouTube. So if you're watching through YouTube, please cast your votes. On screen, we have Lucien, the Dreaming's hyper-competent librarian, Matthew, who is the Dream's smart-talking raven, Fiddler's Green, a creature of the dreaming, played by the lovely Stephen Fry, who you might recall or remember as the person who narrated all of the Harry Potter audiobooks, if you grew up with that. And finally, you could also suggest a different character who is not on screen to accompany you in your journey. All right. I'm going to cast my vote as well. All right, cool. And of course, you can use the chat if you have some strong feelings about the people here on screen. Or perhaps there is another person that you want to, another character that you would like to join on your quest. Type it away. Okay. All right, here are the results. For the people on Zoom, the winner is Lucien, followed by Matthew, last with Fiddler's Green, and then of course there are a couple who answered other. Now on our YouTube live stream, 80% of people answered Lucien and 20% of people answered other. So it looks like Lucien is our winner for this round. Of course, that does make sense. She's so hyper competent, just a goddess, the best OIC officer in charge of the dreaming. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your answers. Now, for those who have said other, if there's a character that you chose who's not here, I'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear from you. Just raise your hand. Don't be shy. We don't bite. And you can share that with the rest of the call. In our audience, we have, okay, great. Hi, Sab. Sab raised their hand. Hi.
From Nova Scotia, Canada, it's 7 a.m.
Oh, thank you for joining us. Good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning, good evening. The character I wanted to join with me on my quest is Corinthian.
Oh yeah, I knew someone would answer the Corinthian. And
I just
why?
would get stuff done is all.
Sorry, could you say that again? I didn't quite
I
catch
think
that.
we would get stuff done. He's a very driven, very focused, very efficient character.
That's true. That's true. I mean, the Corinthian has his faults, but he is very efficient. And in the comments, we have Laurel. Hi, Laurel. Yes, if you could get him to cooperate, he would indeed be helpful. That's true. He'd probably do something behind your back, but I mean, personally, I would take him just because he's kind of cute, but that's just me. Okay. We have here Clifford, who is one of our First Look Club members. Clifford, would you like to share your answer? Who did you vote for? I'm curious.
Matthew. I picked Matthew, but not because of the events in Sandman, but what happened after.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, well, it's not really a spoiler because it's probably not going to be adapted, but there's a comic series after Sandman called The Dreaming.
Right.
And Matthew's there, and there's this I think that was a three issue arc where Matthew went with the Corinthian, but it's kind of a different Corinthian.
Right.
And yeah, well, you'll have to find out. I'm still hoping it gets collected because right now the only way you can get the dreaming is through these things, single issues.
Wow.
Yeah.
Damn. Thank you for sharing the information, and thanks
Sure.
for telling us about the kind of next saga of Sandman comics. All right, cool. Thank you so much, Clifford. Anyone else? Did anyone else answer Matthew in this call? You can raise your hand. You can say it in the chat. I would love to have Matthew as a companion because Matthew just seems like someone you could really rely on a tight spot if you're in a pickle. But Matthew is a bird, so when you don't have thumbs, there are only so many things you can do. All right. Anyone else want to share? I think Tin unmuted herself. Tin, would you like to share? Oh, is that an accept? That's fine. All right. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your answers. Let's move on to our next question. Okay. When did you first discover The Sandman? Was it through the comic or the show? You can raise your hand if you would like to share. Me personally, I discovered it through my older brother and, the little sister trying to be cool. I was like, I want to know, what is this? A Sandman thing. I read it in high school and I loved it. Now that was a long time ago. I've kind of forgotten the plot. So it's really fun to rediscover it through the comics and through the show. Great. Okay. So some people who raised their hands. Worm, hello. And I really like your profile picture, although I won't give away who that is. Worm, how did you discover
The
Sandman?
First off, I want to say at the Ariel, it's really cool that you discovered Sandman really early on, because I would give anything to have the Sandman way before, but I was really young, so
right.
But yeah, basically I discovered Sandman through the show. It was honestly just out of curiosity, but as soon as I really got into it, I realized just how interesting it is in a literary standpoint.
Yeah.
Because it's not really the typical kind of comic book story. You know what I mean? It's
Totally.
especially when I started reading the comics, it really gave off the vibes that I really do need to pay attention to this because it has something really meaningful to say. And yeah, it really does. And also, it's just really cool. The world building is really solid. I mean, what else can we say about Neil Gaiman? So yeah, that's it.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing. And you did say something about like, oh, I wish I discovered it earlier. Well, you're discovering it now, and I think that's perfectly fine. So
Yeah.
welcome. And yeah, you can like shoot me a message and we can talk about the comics. Thank you so much
Yes.
for sharing your,
Thank you.
your form. And all right, maybe we could hear from Laurel. Hey, Laurel, how'd you discover the
Hello.
comics? Hey.
So I actually read the comics a little over a decade ago.
Oh,
My
wow.
library had them all. It was
Cool.
wonderful. And I enjoyed them, but I didn't love them except for the Dream Hunters novella. I adored that one. But I didn't really think
Yeah.
about it again until
Right.
I heard there was an adaptation coming out. I'm like, oh, I remember reading that. A decade ago. And I'm like, I remember really liking the Dream Hunters, and I didn't remember a whole lot. Like, I remember how it ended, but I didn't remember a whole lot of the previous comics. So I'm like, you know what? I've read
Right.
it. I'll watch the adaptation, and then I'll reread the comics so that I'm not expecting a whole
Yeah.
lot going in. And I
Right.
have seen it 3 times now. I don't rewatch TV shows. I
Right.
love the adaptations so much.
Mhm.
So I now actually don't know the comics and never read them again because I just love the
Right.
adaptation that much. But I'm very glad it came out because I probably would have never revisited The Sandman otherwise, except maybe that novella.
Right. Thank you for sharing. And wow, I mean, like, props number one to your library, having everything. And I can imagine you like a decade ago being like, yeah, I'm going to take everything out, just like go through this. And again, props to you for watching the adaptation 3 times and rediscovering the comics again. We're kind of on the same boat about that. Like, now that the show is out, I was like, oh, I kind of pulled out the comic book just to double check and see how the characters looked illustrated versus portrayed on screen. And it's so much fun to do that. And I'm sure you've done something similar watching it 3 times. Great. Thank you so much for sharing your answer. So I hope it's fine if we move on to our next question. I know there are other people who want to share, but yeah, maybe in the next question, we can have an opportunity to talk and share with the group about our opinions. All right, cool. Next question is, this is I would say a page to screen question. What do you think of how the characters were adapted from comic to film? Who are your favorites? All right, so you can use the chat, you can raise your hand. I will go ahead and start by saying Joanna Constantine. Wow, just I'm in love with her. Like, oh, okay. I again read the comics and it was actually John Constantine, who I didn't know his name was pronounced as Constantine because the 2000 something movie with Keanu Reeves was like, his name is Constantine. So it's a revelation to me that it's actually pronounced Constantine. So anyone want to share their favorite characters? You could use it on the chat. You could share it on the chat. You could raise your hand. You could also share a character maybe you don't like. All right, Clifford, hello. Would you like to share who your favorite character is?
Well, I am a huge Hellblazer fan. So John Constantine, or in the show it's Johanna Constantine. But what I really like about the adaptation is because if you read the first volume, there are superhero elements in it. The Martian Manhunters there. You have Miracle Man, I think. But they removed all that from the show, and I think that's a good move because they would have to explain why those characters are in there. And so it's a pretty self-contained story. And here's one thing though: the Ruby
Right,
that John D. Anyone here who watched Wonder Woman 84?
I did. Oh wait, no, I did not.
Okay, for those who watched it, the thingy, the dreamstone the MacGuffin in the movie, it's the exact same dreamstone that's in Sandman.
Whoa.
So if you adapt it directly from the comics, that's going to be a whole lot of explanation. So I'm glad that they removed all the superhero elements and made it more streamlined.
Right. Awesome. Thank you. You have such like encyclopedic knowledge, Clifford. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna watch Wonder Woman, and I'm going to like watch out for that Ruby. From the YouTube comments, we have someone said, I think this is Copycat Killer. I believe that's their username. Someone said, love how they kept Corinthian, of course, sexy, both in page and screen. Like they knew what they were doing. Yeah, I mean, like on the page, I was like, all right, he's in a tank top and he's got like sunglasses on, but on screen, ooh, there's something about the Corinthian appearing in different eras and still keeping his kind of like ageless Corinthian look. And he's just so attractively played by the actor who I believe his name is Boyd Holbrook. I think that's his name. So yeah. Also from the YouTube comments, we have Matty V. Name, Death of the Endless, My Beloved. I too really, really love Death. Again, I discovered the comics through my brother. So I like identified as Death, like, oh yeah, I'm the sister or whatever. And I think she's also really, really cool in the TV series. Great. And in the comments of our Zoom chat, love Lucien and Hob Gadling. Yes, Laurel, agree. And actually a huge fan of Rose Walker on screen. Was only middlingly interested in her arc in the comments, but Kyora, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, as her on screen brought her into my realm of favorite characters in a way I didn't expect. Yes, thank you for pointing that out. As I was reading or rereading The Doll's House, I was like, for some reason, Rose Walker seems more whole and more developed in the Netflix adaptation, and you really root for her and love her, and you're like wishing that she finds Jed. Poor Jed, this poor kid. Okay, and Sab says, Mason A. Park as Desire stole the show. Yeah, what an attractive person. I was like, okay. All right, I'm just reading from the comments here. Yes, they're stunning as Desire. And it seems that everyone is really, really happy with the casting. Yeah, I enjoyed seeing how these comic book characters translated on screen in real life. Even their costumes was kind of something very interesting to look at. Okay, let me check. All right. So I think we can move on to our next question. Thank you very much for sharing who your favorite characters are. I believe this is fourth or fifth question. Next one. Did the TV version of the characters and realms meet your expectations? For those who have not read the comics, what place, time period, or universe in the show would you like to visit? All right. Anyone, you can raise your hand. There's some more people answering about their favorite characters from the previous question. Joe's favorite is Dream, emo boy. All right, that's cute. It's true, he's really intense, but I like him a lot. Okay. Sab says, this is a part where I scream about how well cast Tom Sturridge is. I know a few years ago there were buzzings about it being another person like Tom Hiddleston or whatever, but no, Tom Sturridge like killed it as Dream. I think really gave Dream a different dimension that I wasn't expecting. Cool. So yeah, our question is, did the TV version of the characters and realms meet your expectations? For those who have not read the comics, what place, time period, or universe in the show would you like to visit? Me personally, I expected the dreaming to be a little bit more surreal and weird on screen. To see, in the first few minutes of the show, episode 1, it's like a whole world, a whole fantasy world. And I was like, oh, that is so cool. I mean, I expected it to be stranger, but as I watched the show, I was like, no, I'm like fully immersed in this version of the dreaming. All right, so Renee answered in the chat, I would really love to visit the library in the dreaming. It's like paradise. That's true. Like, and just to hang out with Lucienne. I'd love to be her intern. I mean, she'd be a scary supervisor. She's strict, but like, yeah, I too would love to hang out there. Lucienne's library. Thank you, Jarvik, for sharing that. JC, the dreaming does seem kind of underpopulated in the show or in the comic. I'm curious. All right. In the show. That's true. Well, we do see only about 30 seconds of like the functioning dreaming, and then the rest of the time it's the ruins, the ruins that Lucienne tried so hard to salvage. But thank you for sharing that insight, JC. Now I kind of want to look back and see like, oh yeah, where is everybody? Okay. Clifford says Destiny's Garden. Ooh, that's in the comics. You'll have to read it if you haven't. To those on the call. And Laurel says, seconding Lucien's library. All right. Sab says, if they adapt Season of Mists for season 2, we are going to see so many dreaming creatures. Hashtag spoilers. Ooh, that's very exciting indeed. I'm trying to recall if I mean, I do remember the dreaming being more colorful. That's probably why my expectations were a little colored, seeing the show. All right, cool. So those are the places we'd like to visit. Those are the differences in the comics and in the show that maybe met our expectations and did not meet our expectations. Is there anyone who wants to comment about characters in terms of the TV version versus the comic version? I think notably for me, again, it's Joanna Constantine. I think it was cool that they cast this person who might be more well-known in the Doctor Who fandom in The Sandman. So cool. All right. Yes, Laurel, you raised your hand. Would you like to share?
One of the things that surprised me the most from the adaptation was actually Jessamy. And I'm hoping if it is renewed, we get some like flashback scenes of her, because in the comic, she doesn't die like that in that way. That's like completely in the show adaptation. And I was like, boy, I swear she was there way more often. I had to go back and check because it'd been so long. I do love Matthew in the show adaptation, though. He's so sassy.
Yeah.
And I understand, I think, why they made that choice. Because it definitely adds to the first episode and gives a lot of context for future ones that you wouldn't get if you weren't familiar with the comics. But it was a huge surprise to me because I'm like, am I remembering this wrong? Which is entirely possible because it'd been like a decade, but I was pretty sure Jessamy had been there more. So that was one of my first big surprises about an on-screen change.
That's true. I mean, we don't even hear Jessamy's voice technically. So thank you so much for sharing that. I agree. I think the switch of the Ravens so early on and having Matthew as this kind of smart talking animal sidekick was really interesting. I think another person raised their hand. Yes, JC, would you like to share?
Yeah. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
All right.
Yes, we can hear you.
An interesting change is the character of John Dee.
Right.
In the comics, he was just sadistic. It's like the things he did were like born of, he was kind of either bored or just malevolent, or he was truly unhinged. But in the show, they gave him a reason for doing this, for doing the stuff he did, and because of his motivations, the 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 sh- the things that went down in the diner, though in broad strokes, it's kind of the same. It unraveled differently. Like there's a reason. Okay, he's doing this. Why? And then he's going. Okay, so why is he doing this? Whereas in the comic, he just, "Oh, I'm just getting these people to hurt get into self harm and reveal the darkest the darkest parts of themselves because it's fun."
Right.
And
Right.
I think it's a good thing because in this day and age, and maybe because it's television, it's like um people can only stand so much nihilism and violence for the sake of violence and gore for the sake of gore. So I think it was a good change.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think revisiting the comics, I was surprised, as Laurel said in the chat, no Dr. Destiny, right? Either because of the removal of the DC hero elements. It almost made it more terrifying that he had a reason here, less of an absolute evil and instead a human evil. Yes, I agree. I feel like I forgot the actor's name, the guy who is playing John Dee in the TV show. If you could write that in the chat, I would really appreciate that. There we go. Thank you, David Thewlis. I hope I'm saying his name right. Professor Lupin, that's how I remember him. Really gave John Dee a kind of tragic, a tragic dimension that I did not feel for that character at all in the comics. But in the show, you're kind of like, oh, this poor little man in his pajamas, you know. Thank you so much, JC, for sharing that. Now we can hear from one last person before we move on to our next question. I think Jarvik raised their hand. Hello, Jarvik.
Hello,
Would you like to
can you
share?
hear me?
Yes.
So I actually reread the comics about last week, and the thing that I noticed that had a change in characterization was Dream. It was subtle, but it was there. Like I noticed it when I was reading the story with Constantine. Uh, in the comics, John Constantine asked to get rid of his nightmares. In the show, he offered it to Johanna. So I think it's even that simple, subtle change that means, I mean, in the comics, it's like after he got what he wanted from John, he didn't care. John had to ask him, but in Johanna, he actually thought of her and was willing enough to remove her nightmares from her. Yeah.
That's yes, lovely insights, everyone. And thank you for sharing that. It's true. I feel like Dream in the show, at least for the first two graphic novels, is more benevolent and a little bit softer. And I think that's what makes Tom Sturridge's Dream, I guess, more lovable. Like he does offer Joanna without kind of like a compensation or a reward for helping him get his sand back. So thank you very much for sharing that, and thank you everyone for sharing your insights. This is all really, really interesting. And if it's not too late, if you weren't able to share your kind of favorite change or interesting change now through the Zoom call, you can always type it up in the comments. So thank you. Let's move on to our next question. All right, now this is more about the comic. The comics were generally episodic in structure, with some arcs spreading across 3 to 4 issues. What did you think of the changes the show implemented to make it have a traditional season-long arc? I thought it was I guess me personally, I thought it was slightly kind of like a lot of story in one season. But when I was watching it, it didn't feel that way at all. So I want to hear what everyone else thinks. You can, again, raise your hand or say so in the chat. The question is, the comics were generally episodic in structure, with some arcs spreading across 3 to 4 issues. What did you think of the changes the show implemented to make it have a traditional season-long arc? Yeah, I thought it was pretty clever. I mean, I didn't really mind it so much. All right, we have Clifford. Clifford raised their hands. Would you like to
Hey.
share? Hey,
Well, I was thinking because comics and TV are two different
right.
storytelling mediums. So obviously, I think it's necessary to change. But then again, if you think about it, the only episodic arc was the first in Preludes and Nocturnes because the comics were written that way. Every issue has a different story and even a different genre. The first
Right.
issue was gothic horror, and you get gore in issue number 5, I think, the diner issue.
Yeah.
And then the comics only found its voice when the Doll's House began. That's when it started. Neil Gaiman started doing those longer arcs. So you got
Right,
Season
that's
Mists, and even overarching arcs that span all the way to the issue number 75, the last issue.
Right.
In fact, with regards to the books, the collected editions, The Doll's House was the first Sandman book, not Preludes, that was collected much later.
Right.
So if you're looking for first prints, you'll never really find an earlier version of Preludes and Nocturnes that's printed earlier than The Doll's House,
Right.
if that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Oh man, that's something I didn't really think about, like how the first graphic novel is actually quite
The Doll's
different
House.
from The Doll's House. And The Doll's House, yeah, that's a good point. Like Neil Gaiman kind of, I guess, wrangles, or it feels like, he wrangles the story and makes certain decisions, and it's more clear. Thank you for sharing that, Clifford. Others who have raised their hands, let me check. All right. I think we can hear from maybe Nigel and then Worm. Nigel, what did you think?
Hello. So I think first to start, Desire appearing randomly at the end of episode 5. I think when I watched that, I was like, oh, hello. Oh, what are you doing here? Because they don't appear in the comics until the start of the Doll's House arc, and it's just a very fun tie-in. Then episode 6 with when they combined The Sound of Her Wings and Men of Good Fortune, I think. I just feel like that's a really, really nice juxtaposition wherein one sort of focuses more on death and the other focuses more on life. And so it's like, it shows, I guess, the value of death and the value of life in just one episode, and it's heavy, of course. But it was a really nice change. So I will say I did kind of miss the last panel of issue of The Sound of Her Wings, where Dream is like very happy, and he says, I have a purpose again. But to have Dream and Hobgoblin longingly staring into each other's eyes was a very nice gift to us.
That's true. That's true.
And I guess her final observation was Galt, who does not appear, at least in the first 2 volumes. But I think she really gives Dream an arc, like a television arc, where people have to change, for them to be relatable. And just removing Brute and Glob, those 2 weird, those weird nightmares. Also, it, I guess, streamlined the whole Lyta Jed thing, where they live in his mind or whatever. It was a bit confusing in the book, but I guess I think just having that change really not only streamlined the arc of the show, but also gave new opportunities to tell, say, like a story in a different way, but still doesn't really change anything further down the line.
Right.
That's all. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you. Yeah, you're right. Like putting Hobgadling's story, who was, I think Laurel mentioned in the chat that the Hob is also one of their favorites. So Hob and Death's stories together in one show is a great juxtaposition. It was, and I agree with Laurel, who said in the chat, like it's one of their favorites. It is also one of my favorites. It's so moving. It's the one that made me cry, like yeah, just the faucet that were my eyes turned on, crying really hard during that episode. Thank you, Nigel, for sharing that. All right, and we can hear from Worm before we move on to our next question. Worm, what did you think?
Hello.
Hi.
I'm just gonna keep this a bit short because like a lot of the thoughts that I had were already mentioned. But I'll
Right.
just, I guess a little follow-up thing is because I first discovered the Sandman story through the Netflix version.
Yeah.
And later on read the comics. Of course, I think the show kind of got more wired into my mind than the comics. So I'll just approach this in a way that I would with typical screenplays. So I really do think that they did a really clever job adapting the stories to make it more understandable to people who actually never heard of the Sandman before, like me.
Yeah, that's true.
And
that's true.
I think that's actually really an important thing because at first I was really worried in reading the comics because I was not really well versed in the DC lore. I wanted to,
Right.
but they really did an excellent job in kind of making it their own outside of the DC world. So people who don't have any ideas of it can get into the comics, and with that, it makes the comics relevancy or something longer, and that's a really good thing. It's more people can experience the same story that we experienced, and I think it's just really cool.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you for sharing that, Worm. You're right. Like kind of making the Sandman a more, like you mentioned, you don't need to read the comics to be able to get into the story. And they did remove that DC element, which I found pretty refreshing. JC says in the chat that Brute and Glob aren't original Gaiman characters. They are DC. That's something I had no idea about. So thank you, Worm, for sharing. Laurel also said in the chat, in making it a season, they made it distinctly Dream story. I think those changes are most obvious with Jed, Lyta, and Rosa's stories. Many elements still remain, but those stories aren't as intertwined in the comics. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your insights. We're ready to move on to our next question. So actually taking off from something that Nigel said about hobgaddling and death being put together in one episode, what was your favorite storyline from the TV series? Was there a storyline from the first 2 Sandman volumes that you wish they explored? What are the ones that you are excited to see? Me personally, I was surprised that, or I guess it was a good decision not to include the whole Nada and Morpheus story. You do get like 5 seconds of her in hell where she's like, I'm so sorry, please get me out of here. So yeah, that was interesting that it wasn't there. All right, let's hear from Sab. Sab, you raised your hand pretty quickly. What's a storyline you wish to explore?
To explore one that I like from the
one that you like it. You can answer both.
Yung episode 6 was mentioned several times. I really, it's my favorite episode because they really adapted the sound of her wings so beautifully.
Yes.
the kind of bond that Dream and Death have. But
Right.
I also like the bonus episode with Dream of a Thousand Cats and Calliope, because
Yeah.
it's super clever that they use, which is like, it's obvious, but it's also so clever that they use animation to bring the cat story to life. And then of course you have like the cameos like as voice actors in that episode, which is great.
Right.
Really like a heart-wrenching story about like cats and
Yeah.
kind of just also shows how Dream is like so out of earth and not human that he would sell out the entire human race to a bunch of cats. And
Right. Right.
but then also the Calliope story was very, very beautiful and nuancedly good adapted. It was really
Right.
done, and there was a lot of I think they expanded a lot more on her character and the implications of like um of that story in like a more modern context. Yeah.
Right. Thank you for sharing, Sab. That's true. I found the bonus episodes really interesting. What did everyone else think? Did you like the cat and Calliope or Calliope story? I mean, the cat one also made me cry because I have like cat. I'm a cat owner, so yeah, that really tugged on my heartstrings. All right, maybe we can hear from JC, and then we can proceed to our next question. I hope that's all right with everyone since it's around 6:51, and we still have a couple more questions to go before we end. So JC, what did you think?
Just to echo Sab's thoughts, yes, I of course, like everyone else, probably in the whole wide world who's watched the series. So that is The Sound of Her Wings and the bonus episode. I would like to add though, I think it was very smart to hold off. It was very smart of, I don't know who decided to do it, to
Yeah.
hold off the bonus episode, because I think if it went straight the heels after the conclusion of the Doll's House, it would have confused people. What does this have to do with anything? And then
Right.
I think what the show is trying to do is to ease in the reality of the comics, that some of the
Right.
stories are anthologies, that they are only loosely connected, and it's not
Yes.
an arc. So I think that's what they, and I think, yeah, intelligently did here. It's not always gonna tie into everything, but at least narratively, but
Right.
the themes are always there. The power of stories, the power of
Yes.
belief, and the creative the creative process, and
Right.
yeah, that's all I have to say.
Yes, thank you. And you're so right in that sense. Like I did feel like despite whatever changes or decisions they made, they stayed true to the kind of themes and the mood and the essence of these stories. And great that you pointed out that it's actually an anthology. So thank you so much. In the comment section, we have Jarvik. So nice to hear from you. Yes, Sound of Her Wings was amazing. Kirby was great as Death. She captured that soft and loving energy that I imagined she had in the comics. Sorry, but Kat Denning's Death from the audiobooks just didn't have that IMO. Yeah, that's true. There is an audiobook version of The Sandman. So that's another thing, another piece of media you could compare the comic and even the TV show to. And thank you for bringing that in, Jarvik. And Laurel says, Calliope was another story arc I ended up appreciating more in the adaptation. It relied quite a bit less on in-your-face sexual violence and more on implication, which I felt echoed the changes made to John Dee's story as well. It was more insidious. It also sets up for an Orpheus storyline if they get a second season. Thank you. And we have more comments. Yep, more about Kat Dennings. Nigel says, I'll probably adapt Nada's story for season 2 when they do Season of Mists. And Worm says, I'm a sucker for lore, so I can't wait for Song of Orpheus or Thermidor. James says, I like that there weren't any graphic, well, I'm not going to say that word because we're on YouTube, but graphic violent scenes when it comes to Calliope. Clifford says, looking forward to them adapting the Emperor Norton story. Thank you, everyone, for sharing what you're excited about, what your favorite story arc was from the TV show. If you haven't spoken yet, it's no pressure, but we'd love to hear from you. Just use the chat, or you can, raise your hand and unmute. So yeah, we're down to our last, I believe this 3 questions. All right, next up. The comics were written in the late 80s to the mid 90s. How did you think the show did in bringing the Sandman narratives into the 21st century? This is actually what we were discussing about Calliope's, the changes in Calliope's story really is a good, I guess, takeoff point to discuss this. So, all right. And before we move on, in the chat, Hannah is defending Kat Dennings. She loved a rougher, more casual death, like someone you could have a snack and beer with. But I also did love Kirby. Her death was someone I'd love to hug. That's true. Jamie Chung is an underrated death. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with Jamie Chung. But thank you for sharing. Okay, so going back to our current question. What did you think about the Sandman, how the Sandman show in particular brought the narratives into the 21st century, since the comics were made, I guess, is that 2 decades ago, 20 years ago? All right, Nigel, you raised your hand. What did you think?
Okay. So this might not be a very serious answer, but I just think that moving the timeline to now gives Dream a better reason for being late to have Godling's meeting. Because in the book he was late, but very, I guess, normal human time late. But in the show he was decades late, because they did not move his capture, but they moved his release, or his rescue or release, I guess is the term. So he missed the 1980s meeting with Hub, and he was really late for that.
He was really late. That's true. Yeah, and I think it gives so much more meaning to their friendship that Hub was like, okay, he didn't show up for this one, I'm gonna show up for the next one. I thought that was really sweet. You're right, because in the comic, like Hob has never stood up. Like Dream just shows up with a very 80s pop punk like haircut in the comics. And I thought that was hilarious. Oh my God, Sab, you're so funny. She goes, Filipino time in the chat. Who knows? Morpheus could be a Filipino king. Or, Filipino time. That's an interesting reading of Morpheus's tardiness. All right, thank you so much, everyone. You could still share it in the chat about what you thought. I thought the changes of certain genders, the gender swaps, and the, I guess, changes in other people's race was also very, very interesting. I love seeing more than just like Caucasian people on screen. It makes the story more real. And I guess, there have been many discussions about representation, and representation is very, very important. Clifford says, I love how the security guard is reading Stephen King's It in the comics and in the show. Attention to detail, I tell ya. Yeah. I'm gonna pick up my comic book later, and I'm gonna flip through the security guard and check that out again. So yeah, thank you very much. Okay, JC, would you like to share? You raised your hand.
Sorry. Before the show, when the show was announced, and before we really knew anything about it, I was hoping that they'd keep the story in the 90s.
Okay.
Because I grew well. The 90s was an interesting time for me because I'm not sure how young the people are here, but I was already alive during the time during the 90s. It was a very interesting. I really would have liked because I don't think there's a lot of media and caps. I don't think there's a certain nostalgia for the 90s yet. It's only
Yeah.
the 80s, the 70s, the 60s.
80s. Yeah. You're right.
I would have liked to seen a sort of like a time capsule, the show as a time capsule for the 90s. But at the same time, I can appreciate why they made it more modern because for the most part, this show was filmed during quarantine. So the logistics of that would have been very difficult. And the budget, the budget of maintaining the 90s look all throughout the show, that would have skyrocketed broke the bank. And
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And another thing that it's also a good move that looking back, it's a good move that they did move it to the present because that made the themes and the messages more timeless because it was important back then. They're still important now. But if for what somehow if somehow they did preserve the show in the 90s, it might seem the messages might be diluted because people will think, oh, this is no longer relevant. And
that's true.
Yeah. People might think that because people think funny anyway. Yeah. So
that's true. And sorry, go ahead.
That's my 2 cents there.
Right. And that's true. And I think putting it in the 21st century, people are equipped with certain vocabulary, especially in terms of gender identity, that maybe in a 90s story would be like, they didn't, that wasn't a thing in the 90s, right? I remember Desire in the comics, they used it for desire, whereas today desire is they, them, So thank you so much, JC, for sharing that. That perfectly dovetails to our next question. This is kind of my favorite. I would say it's an interesting thought exercise, which is, how do you think The Sandman would be different if it were adapted to film or TV 20 years ago? So recently I watched Interview with a Vampire, the movie version, and then the TV version. Lots of similarities, but boy, are those two forms of media different. Or you could really see the time period. All right. And oh my gosh, Clifford, from the previous question, Despair War Crux. That's true. I kind of love like 2021, 2022 Despair because honestly, on a bad day, same girl. That's how I look like. That's how I feel. That is my dress code. So thank you for pointing that out. Okay, and to answer how do you think The Sandman would be different if it were adapted to film or TV 20 years ago? Clifford, I'm interested to hear what you would think.
I was actually thinking about the Dark Crystal Labyrinth, the never-ending story. I mean, the production values of those movies. Let's say it was, but actually, Sandman was actually in. Neil Gaiman was actually pushing for a Sandman movie as early as the early 90s, and then it can just got passed around. But if it was made at the time, I think Jim Henson's studio would have had a hand in doing the creature effects, and they would have had practical sets, which right now, looking at right now, if you rewatch like those movies made in the 80s, they actually look good, and it's not like it's not like it's CG. Right now when you see something in CG, we are sort of like desensitized to CG backgrounds, creatures, but
the Marvel effect.
Right. Yeah. I mean, nothing. I like Marvel, but those movies from the 80s and the 90s, they're something else.
They are. That's true. Go ahead. Sorry.
Sorry, I think it would have worked. Although
Yeah.
the thing with the trend at during that time, 80s and 90s, they being faithful to the source material isn't as a requisite. Like now, if people would clam there's a major change that's sort of
Right.
against the backbone of the source material, that people would like, that's, well, they didn't have like Rotten Tomatoes in anything at the time. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, yeah, but I've been talking too much. It's the caffeine,
No,
really.
no. That's really interesting. Like, especially, oh my God, now I want to see like Jim Henson. How would you have done this? How would you have designed the creatures of the dreaming? How would you? Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
And um, you're right as well in that these kind of old practical effects and practical sets, movies, it's like the sets and the creatures, they're timeless. Sometimes what ages the film or what ages the story is like the actor, the hairstyling, the costume,
Yeah.
right? So thank you. And I imagine it would be kind of like big budget, like, I don't know, Tom
I wonder
Cruise.
how. I would love to
Yeah.
see a Jim Henson version of Martin Tenbones.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Martin Tenbones, the big white
Oh my God,
creature.
that's true. Martin Tenbones, who is like in the comic and in the show, they look really similar. But oh my God, yeah, you're right. It would be the elephant from Sesame Street. Could be, who knows, or like a creepier version. Thank you so much. Or even Gregory the Gargoyle, like
Oh
Jim
yeah,
Henson, Gregory the Gargoyle. I don't know. I think
yeah.
it would be
I think the
great.
Dark
Yeah.
Crystal, those creature effects, that would be
Yeah.
really, really.
Yeah. Ooh, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We have people in the comments who, there are a lot of feelings about an older version or if it were adapted in the 90s or in the 80s. XX would probably, oh, that's a spoiler. So it's something about Wanda, the character of Wanda, and the adaptation of A Game of You. Laurel says, I think costuming would be distinctly different, perhaps perhaps a tad more camp, not necessarily bad, but perhaps trickier to take seriously for some people. And agree with Jarvik, getting a big studio to do Wanda sounds near impossible. JC says, I never thought Johnny Depp would be a good Morpheus. In the 90s, I would have casted Adrian Brody. Totally. But yeah, bringing in Laurel's insight, like they'll probably put Adrian Brody in like a crazy Morpheus wig that's like 2 feet tall and like really crunchy looking. Who knows? Sab says, I read the Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio script for Sandman. Ooh, in the early 2000s. It was actually pretty clever, but agree with Clifford. Following the storyline wasn't a prerequisite for movie adaptations, and the soul was kind of sucked out of the plot for that. Yes, I mean, it could have gone completely in a completely different direction. All right, Shah, it's nice that you're raising your hand. I'm excited to hear from you. What do you think?
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yes.
Actually, I was just wondering if what the soundtrack would have been like 20 years ago. I mean, because one of the things that I love about Sandman is that it has a lot of musical references. So I imagine like maybe they would have included, I don't know, maybe this is just wishful thinking on my part, but it would have been cool to see Joy Division or Robert Smith or Tori Amos for, as I said, I mean, I read somewhere they were like the original inspiration for some of the Endless characters. So yeah, that would have been really interesting, especially from what I've been seeing. Yeah.
Oh my God. Thank you. I did not think of how a 90s version would bring in the soundtrack or I guess the OST and the soundtrack. Thank you for sharing that. That's true. I think that's something I noticed in Gaiman's work. There's a lot of like influences to songs existing, tracks, you would say. And it would be great to see how they would incorporate that in film or TV. In the comments, we have Bowie for sure, Lou Reed, Tori Amos, Annie Lennox. Laurel says, in terms of orchestral, I think it might have simply amped up the drama, thinking the intense fantasy music in Lord of the Rings, which were coming out 20 years ago. The pop music would definitely have changed, though. Thank you. And we have Joe, a resident bookworm as well. Hi, I think you're on mute, Joe. Sorry. Did you?
Hi, everyone. I think one of the things that I'd like to point out, if it was adapted 20 years ago, I think it would have changed a lot of millennials. I mean, it would be like a new Harry Potter thing or Lord of the Rings thing, because
Yeah.
a lot would be more endless, or it's like it would be as big as Hunger Games. If it would be that same production as Clifford described, it would be, I mean, it would be
Right.
amazing. I think
Yeah.
some people would have been, I think the emo phase that the millennial experience would have much been earlier because of Dream, I swear.
Yeah.
Those are the ideas.
Yeah.
When I say, if it was adopted 20 years ago, I would be just like 25, 5 years old at that time. So it was like, wow, this is amazing.
That's true,
And
Joe.
I think
Yeah.
Neil Gaiman's writing is already progressive ever since, from his books in
Yep.
Stardust, Those at the End of the Lane. I think a lot of people, I think it would be really, really highly talked about in that terms of
Absolutely.
generation before. So I think those are the things
Absolutely.
that if it happened 20 years ago, it would be amazing. I think despite the value, it's Neil Gaiman's story writing and the storytelling and the characters of themes and all of the endless, to be honest, represent something, and they are so human and non-human like. I think
Mhm.
that would have, I don't know, it would be, I think, life changing for some. I think into that
Right.
level, it was adopted
Right.
20 years ago.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. That's true. Like, imagine how many people it would have influenced. As a myself, I was a baby goth girl. I could imagine me going even more goth if I grew up with something like The Sandman. Thank you so much. So we discussed things from the soundtrack to the practical effects and the sets, possibly by Jim Henson. We discussed casting, and now even how an earlier adaptation of The Sandman would have possibly influenced a generation or a subculture. In the chat, Clifford, wow, I had no idea. Neil Gaiman is a singer now. Just released a single a few days ago. Not kidding. Yep. Well, there you go. I'm gonna Google this right after we end the call. And Clifford says the Constantine story would have been a licensing nightmare back then. It had like a dozen dream songs in that single issue. That's true. Oh yeah, that's true. Like Sweet Dreams Are Made of These, Dream a Little Dream of Me, etc., etc. All right, thank you everyone for sharing your, I guess, adaptation guesses. We're down to our last question. And thank you again, everyone, for spending your evening with us. This has been so much fun. Thank you for sharing your insights in the chat and, turning on your mic and your camera. It was great getting to know everyone. So our last question is, what are our hopes for season 2? Or do we hope for a season 2, period? I mean, I just want it to be renewed, please. I want to see more. Okay, the first two people who raised their hands, Worm and Laurel. So let's start with Worm. What are your hopes for season 2?
Gosh, I never raised my hand this fast ever in my life. But yeah, genuinely, I need Netflix to renew it because Season of Mist has so many characters and so much lore to dive into. And oh god, I really wanted to say something, but the themes of Season of Mist, especially pertaining to, like, how do I say this? Like, almost a little dash of religious trauma and the fear of the creator. The themes like that, they're really interesting, and it showed so much parallels between dream and a certain character that leaves a certain place, if you know what I
Yeah.
mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier in the chat, I really liked lore, and I really hope that they would also dive into that Morpheus's past with Calliope, and
Right.
getting to see Joanna Constantine again. Basically, there's just so much of the world that I've been yet to explore. Also, the endless siblings. I
Mhm.
would genuinely scream if the casting news would come out and we'd see the person on my icon right now. Yeah, just
Yep.
the dinner scene. That's all.
Mhm.
Yes.
Okay. Wow, very cryptic kind of. You're trying so hard not to give
I know.
spoilers.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for being very cautious.
Yes.
But I think a handful of us on the call know exactly what you're talking about, and I
Wink,
agree
wink.
with you. Yeah, wink, wink. I need a season 2 for those reasons. Okay, Laurel, and then Sab has raised their hand. So Laurel, go ahead.
So I agree very much with Worm, especially the endless family dinner. I need to see that on screen visually. Sarah Arthur has done a wonderful job with the costuming in season 1.
Yes.
And I'm really, really hoping if they continue, like if season 2 happens, we actually see Dream's fire cloak as well. Because that was like my one disappointment with the costumes, is not being able to see that fiery cloak on screen.
Right.
But also just the costume choices that occur as the series progressed seem to get more and more dramatic in the comics. So seeing that on screen as well, especially for
Right.
Desire and Dream and the other endless siblings, I think would be absolutely fascinating.
Yes.
And with the Calliope episode, they did set up quite well for an Orpheus arc, which would have me bawling my eyes out, but I think to be very powerful on screen.
Yes. Oh my God, I'm getting all excited now. And I'm just like, I kind of want to, like, who do I need to do this to? Be like, give us season 2. Just like, I want to take someone from Netflix hostage and be like, what is it? Give us an answer. All right. Okay, cool. Thank you for sharing. Sab and Clifford, before we move on to our closing, what do you think, Sab?
Yeah, pretty much everything I was gonna bring up was already mentioned, and this family dinner, the costumes, just want to see them put Sturridge in all of the most dramatic like costumes ever, especially when he is holding a certain function at his palace. Yeah, like earlier I mentioned, they they bring in so many more characters, they bring in many more, like you'll be able to see the dreaming more colorful and populated. It'll be pretty amazing. In Season of Mists, Lucifer also has kind of a moment with Mazikeen that I'm interested to see Gwendolyn Christie pull off in the show. So yeah, there's just a lot of like excellent things that would be really interesting and like I think gratifying to look forward to if they were adapted. And yeah, like Dream also has a couple of moments with some of the older characters from I think Rose and Hob are in it as well. So like kind of draw that connection between them and the kind of relationship that they were all implied to have in a kind of like family way in this in the show. Like to see how that translates in this season, this adaptation, that'd be really interesting. They have like a super complicated theory about how they might pull off Season of Mist to make it more kind of action packed in the show, but yeah, we don't have time for that now. Yeah, it's all to think about.
Thanks for sharing, Sab. Oh yeah. Okay, I can't proceed without giving some major spoilers, but I agree with you. I'm gonna read a couple of comments and we can close off with Clifford. So we have here JC, maybe they can use some more obscure spellings of these names. Odin, and so Odin, which is spelled Wotan, and Loki, which is spelled Loge. Laurel, I see what you said in the chat. Dream holding court. That's all I'm gonna say. Worm says gay Gwendolyn. I have such a crush on Gwendolyn Christie. There's like a tall drink of water that person is. Okay. Hobbs' Season of Mist speech, the toast, and yep, Season of Mist has always been about political intrigue and not immortals punching each other. that's what makes it so interesting. Agreed, AC. All right, Clifford, what do you think? I'm excited to hear what you're
So,
excited for.
Well, my biggest concern with the future, well, I'm assuming, let's assume that there's Netflix has greenlighted all the seasons.
Right.
My biggest concern is how they will handle the overture because of
Oh,
the
yeah.
because of the circumstances that that brought Dream, or rather that got Dream captured, is very different in the show versus in the comics. So, but they made some changes, so I'm sure they will find a way to do that. But you know, and then future seasons. Well, I mentioned earlier in the chat that one of my most favorite Sandman stories is the Emperor Norton story, the first and only Emperor of America. And
yeah.
and although I am not expecting them to adapt the story with Element Girl in it, or Element Woman rather, because well, superheroes and both DC properties. So, though that's another favorite actually. Too bad that would. And I mentioned in the chat and earlier that was the message that JC was replying to. The I'm wondering what Netflix will do with the Asgardians in particular in Season Mists, because you have one set of Asgardians in American Gods, the TV series, and then you got the Marvel Asgardians. So how are you gonna make them unique? And how are you gonna make Thor as sleazy as he was in the comics compared to the heroic Thor that most of us know?
Yeah.
So that's gonna be yeah.
You're right. I mean, that is something that Neil Gaiman does really well. You have these really well-known mythological characters, and Neil Gaiman always adds that special something, that special spice that gives them, I guess, for me personally, makes them really interesting, really new, even though I've heard their stories a million times. Even if I've seen, versions of these characters again and again. Thank you, Clifford, for sharing that. And thank you everyone for participating in this discussion. It was really fascinating. I wish I could just at Neil Gaiman and be like, look how smart your fans are. Look how deeply we're thinking about this work and
one
like it. Yeah.
Sorry, one thing. Fully Booked has brought Neil Gaiman to the Philippines twice. Are we getting him the third time? Is third time's the charm?
I have no idea. Honestly, I have no idea, but it would be amazing. And that would be, no pun intended. That would be the dream, just to have him over again and
pun
have him
intended.
meet his fans. Well, okay, fine, pun intended. Yeah, pun intended. In the comments, events fully booked says we're trying, wink wink. So watch out for that. All right, so thank you again for spending the last hour and a half with